Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar. Cookie deprecation has begun. Now what? A closer look at our programmatic ad spending forecast. I'm your host, Becky Schilling, Senior Director of Content at eMarketer, coming to you from New York City. And I'm joined by my colleague, Senior Analyst Evelyn Mitchell-Wolf, who's in Virginia. Hi, Evelyn.
Hi, Becky. I'm excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Before we get into the main presentation, I'd like to thank StackAdapt for making today's webinar possible and welcome Vitaly Pecherskiy, co-founder and CEO of StackAdapt. Vitaly is joining us from London. Hi, Vitaly.
Hi, Becky. Hi, Evelyn. Thanks for having me. Super excited for this.
Thank you for joining us. A few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link with the slides and the recording of today's presentation. We'd love for you to engage with us in the chat throughout the show to hear your thoughts on the programmatic landscape and any questions you may have. Use the chat window on the right of your screen to submit questions at any time during the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can during our live Q&A later. With that, Evelyn, let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Becky. So as this webinar's subtitle suggests, I'm going to be taking us through our programmatic forecast today. I will start by sizing the US programmatic display market and providing some worldwide context. I'll talk through a couple of top-line trends at play at the worldwide level, and then dial us back into the US to discuss programmatic ad spending by transaction method, then device category, and finally, I will go over what's next for programmatic advertising. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to level set. What is programmatic advertising? At eMarketer, we define programmatic advertising as any ad that is transacted or fulfilled via automation. Now, admittedly, that's a broad definition, and it does encompass most of the display market, as we'll discuss. But I find it helpful to make sure we're all on the same page at the outset here. So our programmatic display ad spending forecast includes all display formats, static units, videos, and other rich media. Social networks automate ad serving, so the vast majority of spending in those environments falls into programmatic as we define it. And so when we get to the spending breakouts later in this presentation, I will mention how social plays into the trends that we see. But first, let's see what we're working with here. And let's look at how the US programmatic market is faring. It's faring pretty well. It'll reach $157.35 billion this year, with healthy double-digit growth through the end of our forecast period in 2025. And just a quick note here, we are in the early stages of updating our programmatic forecast package as we speak. So you should expect to see our latest figures plus an estimate for 2026 in the next few months. Now, if we plot worldwide programmatic display ad spending growth, it's obvious how close the US mirrors the worldwide growth trend and vice versa. That's because the US is by far the biggest market for programmatic display ad spending this year and every year historically. So the US comes in at $157 billion, more than twice the size of the second largest market, which would be China, but we'll get there. We break out programmatic ad spending for 6 markets, including the US, and we're going to proceed by region for this. So rounding out North America, we have Canada. It is a much smaller market, and its growth rate is actually the slowest of the markets we break out, likely due to the relative lack of maturity of its programmatic CTV market. Western Europe is next. The UK is the largest programmatic market in this region. Germany is a distant second place in terms of size, regionally speaking, but it will see the highest growth rate of these 3 markets. And then we have France, which is not only the smallest market we track in Western Europe, but the smallest market we break out worldwide. And last but not least, we have China. Like I mentioned before, it is the second largest programmatic market in the world, and it's also the fastest growing for the second year in a row. And as a result, China is growing its share of worldwide programmatic ad spending. And here's where things stood a decade ago. The US accounted for more than 2 in 5 programmatic display ad dollars spent globally. And we fast forward to this year, that hasn't really changed. Not much has changed for Canada, the UK, Germany, and France either. But China's share is much larger, and it's taking that share from the rest of world category, which is to say the markets that we don't break out programmatic ad spending for. But for all its growth, China is the only market we break out that has yet to reach 90% programmatic penetration, which is the share of display ad spending that transacts programmatically. So back in 2014, the US was the only market to leverage automation for over half of display ad spending. Since then, every market except China has passed that 90% threshold. That said, programmatic is clearly the go-to method of media buying across the board, including in China. Right. There are a couple top-line trends that hold true across all of the markets I just discussed. And the big story here is that programmatic ad spending growth will outpace that of non-programmatic ad spending by a lot. And that's because programmatic has a lot of advantages when it comes to flexibility and fluidity. There's a reason why programmatic is the preferred method of buying. It's quick and easy to shift or pull spend. Advertisers can prioritize spend toward channels, platforms, or formats that are driving high returns without the pain of navigating cancellation terms. And there are fewer upfront commitments. I mean, depending on the strategy and the partners involved, there may be no upfront cost at all. This allows for more agile spending decisions if, or more likely when, circumstances change. Another truth of programmatic is that transparency and control are not a given. It takes concerted effort to curate a programmatic supply chain free of unnecessary or unknown intermediaries. And AI-powered products like Google's Performance Max and Meta's Advantage Plus, while popular, give advertisers very little governance over budget allocations and even less reporting granularity. Still, the benefits of automation outweigh the challenges, and advertisers continue to spend the majority of their display budgets in programmatic. And in terms of growth, programmatic kept display afloat last year, which was a tough year given prolonged economic uncertainty. Again, here is US programmatic display ad spending growth, which you've seen before. Non-programmatic was hit harder by that uncertainty. You can see the dip in 2023. But with 9 in 10 display ad dollars transacting programmatically, you can see that programmatic really anchored display ad spending overall. And as for this year, programmatic will grow 3 times as fast as non-programmatic. And this is in the US, but I ran this analysis for each individual market we break out and worldwide, and broadly, this dynamic holds true.
Now, Evelyn, I want to interject here and ask you a question. You defined programmatic earlier for us, but what exactly is non-programmatic? And can you give us a few examples?
Absolutely. Non-programmatic display, let's try that again. A non-programmatic display would be any direct sold inventory with fixed pricing and a predetermined limited campaign window. It's much more time intensive on both the buy and sell sides, with personnel needed to negotiate, set up, and oversee every activation. So it makes sense that less than 1 in 10 display ad dollars transacts that way. But an example would be a brand takeover of a publisher's homepage. So we cannot talk about programmatic without talking about cookie deprecation. And a lot will change when third-party cookies are deprecated in Chrome later this year. First, cookies will officially be absent from all major browsers. Chrome is actually the last domino to fall here. Firefox and Safari abandoned cookies long ago at this point. And if you're wondering why there's so much panic when the shift to cookieless has been in progress for years. It's because Chrome is the most popular browser. It accounts for roughly half of the US browser market, and its share of the global browser market is even higher. So although it's the last domino, it's still a pretty big leap. When third-party cookies are gone, a lot of historical benchmarks will lose their meaning. Just like cookieless targeting looks different, requires different methodologies, so does cookieless measurement, which means it won't be apples to apples to compare the performance of a campaign from last holiday season to a campaign this holiday season. We also expect the identity resolution landscape to change pretty significantly. It won't be immediately after cookies are deprecated in Chrome, but over time, as the dust settles, most identity providers will fold or be absorbed. There are more than 110 solutions out there, according to Prohaska Consulting. That is not sustainable, and the deterministic identifier's effectiveness is predicated on its scale. Those that don't get enough traction won't last long once third-party cookies are gone. And smaller providers with high-quality data, tech, or methodology may get acquired. So we'll see consolidation in the identity space. And these examples are just kind of the tip of the iceberg here. This is a monumental change. It has also been a long time coming, like I mentioned, and because of that, the market has already adapted in some ways, and some general spending patterns will stay the same. So let's take a look here. First up, spending by transaction method. And from this point forward, we're going to be focusing on our US forecast. Now, a quick refresher for anyone who needs it. Programmatic transactions are carried out in several ways. We've put together this handy graphic that identifies the 4 main transaction types. On the right side, we have programmatic direct deals, which specify a fixed price and may or may not guarantee fixed inventory amounts. On the left side, we have auctioned environments, private marketplaces, or PMPs, as I'll refer to them today, which are typically owned by a single publisher or a small group of publishers and are only open to a select number of invited buyers. And the open exchange, which, as the name suggests, is open to all buyers and sellers in the digital ecosystem. Okay, back to our forecast. So first, we'll plot the share of programmatic ad spending happening on the open exchange. It's a pretty clear downward trend since 2013 when we started tracking open exchange ad spending. Meanwhile, programmatic direct's share of the market looks kind of like the inverse. And programmatic direct is taking share from the open exchange, but so are PMPs. It took less than a decade for the open exchange to go from most popular transaction method to least popular transaction method. So most programmatic display ad spending ads transact directly with a specific platform. And programmatic direct is where most social networks play. So as social became more embedded, not only in consumers' media diets, but in advertisers' budgets as well, programmatic direct rose in prominence. Looking forward, we don't expect this dynamic to change when cookies are deprecated. And before I go into why, I just want to mention that spend is growing across all transaction methods. Here are the growth rates in question. There are no negative signs here. So the open exchange is not losing share of the programmatic market because it's shrinking. Advertisers have just invested more heavily in closed and private ecosystems, which would be programmatic direct and private marketplace.
Now, Evelyn, what happened in 2021? Growth spiked across the board there. What's going on?
Yes, it did spike. That's actually something we see across all our digital ad spending forecasts. It really just reflects the market bouncing back from the initial pandemic slump in a big way. And 2022 growth rates were definitely disappointing in comparison, but also reflected kind of a normalization of sorts. Those 2021 growth rates were not sustainable. But I'm glad you brought that up, Becky, because the 2021 growth spike will come back before we wrap up. Okay, so what is driving the trend? Why are advertisers investing more heavily in closed and private ecosystems? First, there's a little thing called supply path optimization. That's when advertisers tighten up their programmatic supply chain, getting rid of inventory resellers or underperforming or redundant partners, which can help reduce hidden fees or fees that buyers don't feel are justified based on the value provided by that partner. Manage ad frequency, minimize risk of data leakage, and decrease the advertiser's carbon footprint. Every hop in the programmatic supply chain is more compute power, so more intermediaries equals more compute costs. And when supply-side players send out bid requests through multiple channels, advertisers can end up bidding multiple times for the same impression, again increasing compute costs and also contributing to overfrequency problems. So prioritizing more direct buying paths alleviates some of these pain points. Second, programmatic is refocusing around first-party data. As signal loss reaches a fever pitch with cookie deprecation, ad buyers and sellers are harnessing their own consumer data for programmatic activation across transaction methods. I have some data here from the IAB that supports this. 6 in 10 buyers reported they'd be focusing somewhat or significantly more on ad placements with publishers with first-party data in 2024. That was the most popular response option. Oftentimes, activating first-party data is easier when working more closely with sellers. There are also usually higher match rates when there are fewer intermediaries involved. Okay, let's break things out by device, shall we? The programmatic CTV market is officially larger than its desktop-laptop counterpart. CTV has steadily been gaining share of the programmatic display market, while desktop and laptop computers have been losing share. And the milestone moment for CTV happened last year. Now we'll talk about what's driving this trend in a second, but I want to clarify that mobile still dwarfs both of these device categories. Its market share has hovered around 70% since 2018. And again, social network ad spending plays a really big role here. Most social activity takes place on mobile apps. I can't even remember the last time I used any social media on my computer. So social's influence is clear here. And as CTV continues to grow, it will likely start to eat into mobile's share of the market, but not in the immediate future. In the immediate future, we don't expect cookie deprecation to disrupt this dynamic. Okay, back to what's going on with CTV and desktop laptop. What's driving this trend? First is consumer behavior. Consumers are averaging less daily time on computers and more than making up for it on their CTVs. I have a few figures from our time spent forecast to back this up. In 2021, consumers spent a little under 3 hours with both device categories. And by 2025, desktop, laptop will have dropped 10 minutes, but CTV will have jumped 47 minutes for a total of 3.5 hours. And advertisers are adjusting their programmatic ad spending accordingly. So let's take a look at growth rates from those same 2 years, 2021 and 2025. So back in 2021, programmatic CTV ad spending was growing more than twice as fast as programmatic ad spending on desktop and laptop computers. The same will be true in 2025. Now, here's where that 2021 growth spike comes back into play. Remember, it was an outlier, 2021. So 2025 growth, the growth rates for 2025 might seem small by comparison, but the important part is that CTV growth will continue to outpace desktop, laptop by a very wide margin. CTV's market share growth is even more impressive when you narrow things down to programmatic video. 10 years ago, almost 3/4 of programmatic video ad spending went to desktop, laptop, and CTV hadn't even entered the picture. By 2019, not only did mobile have a comfortable lead over desktop, laptop, CTV accounted for nearly 1/4 of the market. And this year, CTV will account for over 1/4 of the market. Mobile still has a commanding share, and desktop laptop continues to get squeezed on both sides by CTV and mobile. You might be wondering how CTV can only account for a quarter of the market, considering how much ink is spilled over its growth. I have a few more forecast figures for context. Advertisers will spend about $24 billion on programmatic CTV video ads this year. Meanwhile, advertisers will spend almost $38 billion on social video ads alone. And that's just one facet of the programmatic video, mobile video space. That said, CTV is growing its share of the programmatic video market just a hair faster than mobile. And since it's almost April, which means it's almost May, it's worth mentioning what we expect this upfront season. With a steady drumbeat of cord cutting looming over the industry, streaming and programmatic will play a bigger role than ever in this year's negotiations. So last year, advertisers started having conversations, serious conversations with networks to start accounting for programmatic spend and upfront commitments. This year, advertisers will use those conversations as a springboard to go deeper. So last year, total CTV ad spending was $24.60 billion. This year, there will be an additional $5.5 billion ad dollars in that mix, and we expect 4 out of 5 of those new CTV ad dollars to transact programmatically. All right, what is next for programmatic advertising? I'll leave you with a few big items, and then Vitaly and I will have a little bit of a chat. So first, privacy sandbox tests will gradually pick up steam. Now that a truly cookieless population exists on Chrome, urgency will intensify as we enter Q2. There will be more back and forth between Google and trade bodies like the IAB Tech Lab, and more practical guidance and tools from ad tech entities that want to make it easier to test the APIs. And stay tuned for the UK's Competition and Markets Authority to weigh in here. Its latest report on the privacy sandbox made it clear that Google cannot proceed with its cookie deprecation plans until its concerns are resolved. So there's definitely more to come. Second, smaller advertisers will pump the brakes on the open exchange temporarily. Those with fewer resources will allocate more of their precious ad dollars to closed ecosystems while the open web adjusts to cookie deprecation. They'll return when the heavy lifting is done and long-awaited consolidation of identity solutions has finally taken place. And finally, programmatic will wind deeper into upfront commitments. Those serious conversations that opened new doors during the 2023 upfronts will gain traction this May. And with CTV accounting for virtually all of the converged TV market's growth, sellers will lean into buyers' demands for budget fluidity by using programmatic as an incentive to encourage larger upfront commitments. All right, so that's it for my presentation. Over to you, Becky.
Thank you, Evelyn. That was great. We will get back into it shortly with a special quick take conversation between Evelyn and our special guest, Vitaly Pecherskiy, co-founder and CEO of StackAdapt. All right, Evelyn, back over to you and Vitaly.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, Vitaly. How are you?
Hi, Evelyn. Feeling great. Another day in paradise. Excited for our conversation.
Absolutely. It's always fun to talk about programmatic.
Love it.
So I have a couple of questions for you. We'll start with a forward-looking one. I guess they're all really forward-looking, but how do you foresee the growth of programmatic advertising influencing the broader digital market, the broader digital marketing landscape over the next 2-3 years?
So it's interesting that a lot of your slides reference 2014 as a date that you compare it to now, because it was 10 years ago, and that's exactly the year that we launched StackAdapt. And already we looked at some of the data from eMarketer back in 2014, and we're like, there's a lot of growth in automation of buying of advertising happening, and there's clear case for why it's going to become more and more prevalent. So So that was a trend that we followed from day one, and it was very dear to us. So it sort of follows very clearly the idea that software is eating the world, and you can very clearly see how in digital and mobile it went from essentially being done in a very rudimentary way towards more automated transaction methods. So programmatic, we're clearly seeing the device of TV shifting from done in the traditional fashion towards automated programmatic fashion of CTV. And even CTV still far from the same numbers of display. It's still yet to become fully transacted programmatically. But if you look at sort of even more emerging channels, for example, digital out of home, so programmatic share there represents only about a third of all out of home advertising. So there's still a lot of room for growth in these channels to become digital. So in the case of CTV, it's still not even half of what traditional TV represents. So there's a lot of sort of that first wave is going to happen, basically transformation into digital enabled channels. And then I think there's a trend that's increasingly being talked about related to AI. And to me, that's especially interesting dimension of how to think about programmatic, because that is going to be sort of the next wave of transformation within programmatic, which is very hard to pinpoint exactly how to measure this precisely. But I think if you look at, for example, display, and 90% of it's transacted programmatically, that program 90% or like the fashion in which it's transacted now versus how it's transacted programmatically 10 years ago, it's very, very different. And I think that's an area where we'll see tremendous efficiency being gained by the advertisers. So even though programmatic market will increase, I think the outcomes driven by programmatic spend as is now is going to increase dramatically by the use of AI. So to me, if you ask me what my outlook going forward about programmatic, it's as bright as ever. And I think everything is becoming digital, everything is becoming programmatic and AI enabled. So lots of optimism.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that perspective is certainly something that we see in our forecast as well. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly the share of that digital has of total media spending, but it has gotten a lot higher. The pandemic really accelerated the trend that we've seen coming for a long time, but I believe over the pandemic, we passed that 70% threshold. So the majority of ad dollars going to digital channels, and we see those trends too. So one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation was first-party data, and that kind of being a center of gravity where programmatic ad spending is circling around, that kind of the new use of first-party data. So it's a pretty crucial element of programmatic strategies in the future. Given that crucial role of first-party data in the post-cookie landscape, which inherently faces scalability challenges, what cookieless tactics would you recommend marketers adopt to complement their first-party data strategies?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The first-party data is inherently less scalable, but it's incredibly valuable. And I think you have a little bit of a, if you look at smaller companies, inherently they have less first-party data, but the work that needs to happen to actually maximize the use of it is potentially much more of a low-hanging fruit than for large enterprises. Because with large businesses, yes, you have a lot of first-party data, but the technical infrastructure that you need to have in place in order to maximize the use of it, like it's not a flip of a switch. It's not something that marketing can do in isolation, in a silo. They have to tap centralized corporate IT resources. It involves a much broader sort of data strategy at a corporate level. So as much as marketers want to jump into first-party data, it sort of forces much more difficult strategic conversations at a corporate level. So in my view, first-party data is potentially much of a quicker opportunity for smaller companies because they're inherently much more nimble. They're dealing with less complexity at the infrastructure level of what systems they use. But first-party data is cannot be looked at as a sole strategy, because this is a good place to start. And I think inherently, this is where you really understand your customer, but then you need to start thinking of how you can build from it. And I would say cookieless as a term, I will gradually phase it out in my own vocabulary, because I think 2 years from now, nobody will ever use that term again, potentially. So, so I think it's just going to be just targeting. And I think, if we look at cookieless, naturally people gravitate to things like they automatically think contextual, they automatically think connected TV. But I think having that, the shortcut in thinking of a strategy in relation to cookie deprecation, I think it limits quite a lot in terms of things that you can do. And when it comes to audience targeting, that still flourishes. It's just evolving. And I think the big question there, thinking about how to utilize, for example, audience targeting in the context of cookie deprecation, the big question is just really understanding audience strategy or identity strategy of each one of the individual companies that you work with. So cookieless doesn't automatically mean lack of audience targeting. And I think understanding that naturally opens up a lot more opportunities for how you can execute on your strategies.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I hope we also phase out the term cookieless, although now I'm hoping that all of the content we put on eMarketer that's tagged as cookieless are relevant to those that are looking for information on cookieless stuff. Maybe we'll have to go back and retag them as something else. Okay, so according to the presentation, the report that I just, or the report that the presentation that I just went through is based on, the CTV market is growing very fast, and it's now larger than desktop, laptop advertising. So what tips can you offer marketers looking to add CTV into their marketing mix to ensure that their ads are engaging and effective?
Yeah, so CTV is getting a lot of adoption because of targetability and measurement ability, and I think we've talked about that piece in the previous question. But I think what CTV is unique in is that it really matters what the user sees. And we all grew up seeing ads on TV, and we have certain maybe association with what level of advertising you expect to see on TV, and it's inherently of higher quality. And so I think that's for there's a case that CTV democratizes TV advertising, because it essentially any business could tap into TV as a device, but the barrier to creating really great video advertising still exists. And I think that's potentially a big area for innovation and opportunity for companies, because I think that this channel is where the creative actually matters much more than potentially other channels. And one mental model to think about it, and how we try to think about advertising that we run for StackAdapt, is try to think of, well, if we had a Super Bowl ad spot, like what would we want to show? And sort of try to challenge ourselves to just level up. And if we think of, okay, this is the level at which we can make video ads, can we push ourselves and make it even better? And so that is what I think a lot of brands need to think about when they're ready to start advertising on CTV, because I think it has a ton of potential, but it requires sort of a more thoughtful approach to the creative. And I think even more tactically, I think call to action is just so important when it comes to TV advertising, and I think it's something that's often overlooked.
Absolutely. Well, as someone who watches the Super Bowl exclusively for the ads, I would love to see more Super Bowl caliber ads in the wild throughout the year.
Hard to make those.
I know, yeah. Especially this year, there were so many celebrities. I don't know if I want like just celebrities plastered all over my TV all the time. Well, I mean, I guess they're in the shows that I'm watching, but in the ads too. Okay, we have time for one more question before we dive into the live Q&A here. So what role do you see emerging channels? You mentioned a couple in the answer to the first question that we went through here, but off the top of my head, in-game advertising, digital out-of-home, what role do those play in advertisers' digital strategies, and how can they be integrated effectively into strategies for multi-channel impact?
Yeah, every one of those channels is just so unique. It's so unique, and if you look at, for example, in-game, which is absolutely has been a very hot topic for the last couple of years, and the case through the lens through which everybody looks at the opportunity, they look at it through number of gamers globally, and I think that number is something like 3 billion. But the size of in-game advertising is actually fairly small compared to some of the numbers that we've seen earlier in CTV, and I was thinking about like what are potential barriers in adoption of something like in-game. And I think quite honestly it's just hard to understand potentially for decision makers what they're dealing with. It's much myself, I don't play video games, just not tremendous amount of time right now, so it's hard for me to advocate for a channel, for example, to our marketing team, because it's hard for me to conceptualize what it is, right? Versus, for example, digital out of home, where I see those billboards every day and say, oh, that's a great billboard, or we can tap into this channel. I think obviously, it doesn't stop marketing team from running experiments and presenting a case for why one channel should be run alongside. But I think maybe the way to think about it is that in today's world where you can essentially access all these channels through one unified platform. It's not like it was done before, where everything was like TV, print, radio. It's done incredibly siloed. There's not one centralized view from an audience perspective, reporting perspective. Like, nothing really prevents marketers now from running these multi-channel strategies, and all the data that we have on our end supports that. Channels in the channels when run simultaneously, the performance of that outperforms any one channel in isolation. So there's absolutely the case for running a multi-channel platform, multi-channel campaigns, and you want to find ways to take a campaign that you're looking to run and think of how you can get it across more of these emerging channels, because there's absolutely case for both increased reach, which matters, and just like additional touch points, which also matter. So I think it's starting with a base of we're going to run multi-channel campaigns as a default way of running advertising, and then sort of optimize back from that and seeing where we're seeing success and where we can double down.
Hey, well, thank you, Vitaly. I appreciate all your insight here. Becky, should we bring in the audience now for Q&A?
Let's do it. A couple of sound bites from you guys. Software is eating the world. We need more.
That's not my sound bite. I cannot take credit for that one.
We need more Super Bowl caliber ads in the wild, and goodbye to the term cookieless. Thank you, Evelyn and Vitaly. That was great. We've gotten quite a few questions from the audience, so let's jump into it. Evelyn, I'm going to start with you with this one. What's your take on MFAs?
Ooh, good question. Well, generative AI is about to make the MFA problem a lot worse. And I do want to mention that MFA websites are not problematic simply because they are MFA websites. MFA websites often resort to high ad density, pop-ups, autoplays, and frequent ad refreshing to generate as much ad revenue as possible. And none of those things is a hallmark of a great user experience. When user experience isn't a high priority, that publisher has no reason not to produce content using Gen AI with little to no human oversight. And they can afford to disregard the trade-off in user experience, which is already poor to begin with. So advertisers, my take is that advertisers have to create and reinforce incentives for publishers and ad tech providers to filter out that MFA inventory or not created in the first place, because the current incentive structures are actually contributing to the problem, because ad tech providers get a cut of the transaction regardless of impression quality. And when a brand is promised a low CPM or seeks a low CPM, they're seeking cheap reach, chances are high that MFA or other low quality inventory is used to deflate those average costs. So it's really up to the advertiser to create and enforce those incentive structures that will relieve a little bit of the MFA problem.
Yeah, my perspective on this is that MFA is maybe a new term for something that existed, well, at the very least as far back as our company goes. And we knew that when we worked in the industry, we saw just the scale of number of websites out there where ads can be run. So we've taken from day one an approach of we're going to essentially look through every website that the ads are running on and enable it, basically opt in to run advertising on this on a specific website. Just, you know, MFA definition, I think it needs to be, it's still a little bit unclear exactly where that line lies, because you know, advertising is the dominant monetization strategy for publishers. So I think the main question sort of like is really thinking about like what is potentially wrong with specific domains, right? You need to look at what exactly Evelyn is saying. What is the ad load on these websites? Is that dramatically is it clearly built to gamify the system in a way that's not creating value for the user? What is actually what is the content on this website, right? Because I think probably universally it's possible to say that, with the exception of very few publications, Gen AI is used probably at this point everywhere, even for simple things like grammar checks and spell checks. So everybody is using AI. The question is more about, is it done in an automated fashion to gamify the system, or is it done in a way to just create more value for the user? And I think every single website has to be looked at individually, because there's not a blanket term to say like there's a line and this is MFA, this is not MFA. And I think that's why it's important to have platform or like inventory quality teams and actually continue conducting audits in a way that you can flag potential problematic websites and block them. But it's definitely not a black and white type of question.
Great. We have a question from the audience who says they're always looking for best practices for attribution in programmatic marketing. And they ask specifically, are there privacy regulation issues when tying a programmatic audience back to the individual people who are advertised to? Evelyn, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, you know, like a lot of answers are, it depends. I would say default to yes. There is always going to be privacy implications when identifying a specific individual. And there are ways to do that while, you know, honoring the consumer's preferences when it comes to their privacy and how their data is used. But the default that has been in the market for, you know, decades at this point, to just collect as much data and, you know, connect the touch points regardless of what the consumer would have wanted with that data, that's no longer that's not going to be the case in the future. We're kind of in the transition period here where legislation and operating systems, browser makers are reshaping things to make that not only less possible, but there's also an ethical question here as well. So there are definitely implications for connecting programmatic advertising to an individual for the sake of attribution and broader measurement strategies. And the best kind of first step, I would say, for making sure that you are in compliance with whatever state level or national, if you're not in the US, national level legislation on that front, is to audit your internal data assets and making sure that you don't have any old data that may not only not be accurate anymore, but may not have been collected with proper consents, and because at the time there wasn't really a thought about that, and making sure that everything moving forward is consented, that it is stored properly. There's a lot that can be done just with an initial audit of your own assets, and then from there is a lot more that can go into making sure the whole attribution pipeline is compliant. Vitaly, do you have any thoughts on this one?
You know, this is a very difficult question to answer without a lot of context, and I would say, not being a lawyer, I would advise that it's best to work with either outside counsel or somebody in-house to really dig into specific use cases for each business, because they really vary depending on industry, jurisdiction. So I would point in that direction without sort of I don't think I'll be able to give a
Yes.
concrete definitive answer here.
Definitely work with your legal teams. That should be the first step, actually. So I take back what I said. Start with your legal teams and then do an audit.
We have another question from the audience, and they are asking about growth. And the question was, how will programmatic growth outpace non-programmatic, given all the impending privacy legislations and signal deprecation? Evelyn, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, part of that has to do with definitions. So again, we define programmatic as any ads that are transacted or fulfilled via automation. So automation is a huge part of this ecosystem. I've talked about it, Vitaly has talked about it, and privacy implications aside, automation is not going anywhere, so programmatic is not going anywhere. The under the hood part of programmatic is going to shift, but we also don't believe that all of the shifts that are happening because of cookies it's going to make advertisers spend less on advertising. It's just going to be it's a matter of where those ad dollars are flowing that will change in reaction to privacy legislation, to cookie deprecation. Like I mentioned in the presentation, there are a few broad kind of spending dynamics that will stay the same, at least in the short term after cookie deprecation. But the kind of spending shifts will not be from programmatic to non-programmatic, because the benefits of automation, the benefits of not having to have contracts in place, like with cancellation, or really onerous cancellation terms, those are still very real benefits that can be maintained in a privacy safe manner. Vitaly, what do you think?
No, I think the subject of, for example, usually privacy is discussed in the context of audience targeting, right? And it's just one of the subsets of programmatic. And to your point exactly, I think people want to have direct access to software, which inherently is deeply related to programmatic. So I don't think people will use less software just because, like, privacy regulations and use of software, I don't think those are really related. So in my view, people will only use more software going forward.
The targeting will change, like we mentioned. So
targeting will change.
That's a very valid question. Yes.
Exactly. But the fact remains is that software is just too powerful. It's it makes operations incredibly fast, efficient. It enables collaboration across multiple teams. It just brings a lot of even as simple as workflow efficiencies. It really is hard to walk back on that.
All right, we have time for one more question, and it's another big topic out there: retail media networks. Where do retail media networks fit into your programmatic forecast, Evelyn?
It's a good question. I was wondering when this would come up. Retail media spend is classified as programmatic direct under our forecast. Like social networks, RMNs are also contributing to programmatic direct's dominance. They aren't quite as mobile heavy though, so they don't have quite as strong of an influence on how spending falls by device category. Like if we think about how Amazon is accessed, I have the Amazon app on my phone. I don't use it a ton, mostly because when I'm shopping, I want to have more of I want to have a larger screen and I want to be able to really do my research. And I'm not alone in that. People access Amazon across all sorts of devices, so it doesn't quite have as much of a influence on the spending breakout by device. But yes, it is part of our programmatic direct spending bucket there.
Great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you again to Evelyn for joining us, and a very special thanks to Vitaly and to the team at StackAdapt. Our eMarketer studio team behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. Before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for more live analyst and tech talk webinars on our events page at eMarketer.com/events. On the audio side of the house, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.